be asleep when you get back. I wanna see it when you find out what comet stars and moons are all about. Wanna see
Car by Bill to Spill here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. The War and Peace Report, with President-elect Donald Trump expected to nominate ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State. We want to turn to an investigative series by the Pulitzer Prize-winning news organization Inside Climate News, which revealed Exxon knew that fossil fuels cause global warming as early as the 70s, but hid that information from the public. This is a clip from 2015 from the PBS series Frontline, which partnered with Inside Climate News on the project.
We found a trail of documents that go back to 1977. Exxon knew carbon dioxide was increasing in the atmosphere, that combustion of fossil fuels was driving it, and that this posed a threat to Exxon. At that time, Exxon understood very quickly that governments would probably take action to reduce fossil fuel consumption. They're smart people, great scientists, and they saw the writing on the wall.
One Exxon research project outfitted an oil tanker with equipment to measure CO2 levels in the atmosphere and the ocean.
We were collecting data of the southern Atlantic, the Gulf of Mexico, and the western Indian Ocean. Basically, every hour we would get several measurements, so we had, I called it a data monster.
Today, Exxon says the study had nothing to do with CO2 emissions, but scientists involved remembered it differently.
We were committed, we were doing some serious science. It was a significant budget, I would say on the scale of $1 million a year. And that was a lot of money in 1979.
That was Ed Garvey. From 1978 to 83, he was a researcher at Exxon, where he helped start the company's greenhouse gas research program. Well, last year, Nermeen Sheikh and I interviewed him, as well as Neela Banerjee of Inside Climate News. I began by asking Neela about the investigation by her news organization.
We started looking into early climate change research and became aware that oil companies, at least initially it was BP, but that was later in the 90s, had their own scientists who were looking into this. We then found out from American scientists, government scientists who'd been involved in climate research in the 80s that Exxon was involved. And what ended up happening was that I got a transcript of a 1979 congressional hearing on climate change and tried to see if somebody from Exxon was there, and I found a gentleman named Henry Shaw. Henry was Ed's boss and was the primary researcher with that tanker project. And through him and papers that he worked on, we found other names, we found documents and archives, and slowly we amassed this picture of a company that was clearly aware of the science, of the emerging science of carbon dioxide research, and what the scientists were saying, that it was largely driven by fossil fuel emissions. And they were smart enough to know that this could mean some kind of policy response farther down the road. And so to deal with that, they decided to take a constructive role, and that is to do really good science so that they would be taken seriously in any future policy discussion.
And Ed Garvey, can you talk about when you first arrived at Exxon and the research that you did there? It's an extraordinary finding, 1977. That's almost 40 years ago that Exxon itself was aware of the climate impacts of fossil fuel.
I was hired in 1978 by Henry Shaw specifically to begin the tanker study. He hired me explicitly directly out of school. I was a 22-year-old chemical engineer, but he hired me directly out of school to begin to engineer, if you would, and design a system that could work on an oil tanker to study oceanic levels of CO2. The idea was to study what the ocean was doing in response to the atmosphere so we could figure out where CO2 from fossil fuels was ending up.
And what'd you find?
Well, we didn't get that far along in terms of the data analysis. I mean, ultimately, we estimated the amount of CO2 that was coming out of the oceans and the equator. My thesis advisor at the time, Taro Takahashi, used that data along with other data to estimate the amount of absorption by the ocean in the poles, amount of degassing in the equatorial area, and together he was able to estimate the carbon balance, if you would, around the ocean, the atmosphere, and the biosphere.
But why was Exxon, from what you understand, why was Exxon interested in doing this research then?
It was very much they saw it as a leadership role in many respects. The goal was that if Exxon, given the importance of the problem, Exxon wanted to be at the table in terms of the discussion. The best way to be considered viable in terms of your opinion at the table was to be doing real research. And in fact, we linked up with some of the best researchers in the world at the time regarding CO2 and the global carbon cycle.
You were working with Columbia University?
That's right.
Yes, go ahead.
As well as the Scripps Institute of Oceanography.
When did you start to feel a change in attitude at Exxon about the work you were doing?
For me, it came very suddenly toward the end of my career there. It was gung-ho for 3.5 years, and then the bottom fell out of the oil market, and it really changed. They just basically dropped the project. We had collected a lot of data, but hadn't processed it to the point of understanding the information. We just had a lot of information. Columbia went on and processed the data after my work there.
Neela Banerjee, can you talk about this turnaround, when Exxon stopped the study, what they started to understand, and how they tried to cover it up?
Well, when Ed's project was dropped from the documents we have, and talking to Ed too, it was mainly because of financial reasons. Exxon did not stop its climate research. After it started the tanker project in 78, 79, in 1980 it hired a lot of mathematicians to do climate modeling because models were primitive and they were relying on other people's models, and they wanted to do that in-house. So even though the tanker project, which was relatively expensive, had ended, Exxon continued very good, rigorous, peer-reviewed climate research, mainly through climate modeling from 1980 onward. And our documents go through 1986. And one does not notice the kind of attitude shift that appeared in the 1990s of stalling action on climate change and so on in that period. Exxon was still committed to doing really good science. It was just different from the tanker project. If that was empirical, this was modeling. And then, the first indication that I think all of us, not just Inside Climate News, but the world have of Exxon's attitude on climate change shifting was in 1989 when a group called the Global Climate Coalition was formed. And that was a group of fossil fuel companies, major manufacturers, Americans largely, that wanted to stall action on climate change. They saw that the UN was meeting and thinking about a policy response a country should adopt to cut emissions of carbon dioxide. So what happened in that 86 to 89 period, we don't know. We can't document a shift in thinking. There's some speculation about the attitudes of the people who were in leadership then. They were different than the people who were in leadership in the 70s. But what we have is not an example of a cover-up. It's quite the opposite. What we have is an example of a company that used its resources as one of the biggest energy companies in the world to do really good research.
Banerjee, could you say a little more about this Global Climate Coalition and what Exxon's role within it came to be and how it's impacted the kind of research that's done on climate change?
Well, the Global Climate Coalition, it sounds very green. I remember thinking, oh, this must be a group of companies that actually support action on climate change. But it was led mainly by the auto industry. By the oil and gas industry. But some of the other members were coal companies, auto companies, and so on. And Exxon was probably the leader in the oil industry, working with the American Petroleum Institute, which is the main oil industry lobby. And they didn't take the approach that a lot of people who denied climate change did. And in fact, there's in public circulation, long before we did this project, a primer that a scientist had written for members about how to talk about climate change. What he recommended was not to use the arguments that other climate deniers use, such as that it's sunspots or natural cycles, but instead to focus on the uncertainty of the science and the models, just to hammer away at that. And indeed, people...
Neela Banerjee of Inside Climate News and former Exxon scientist Ed Garvey speaking on Democracy Now! Last year. You can go to Democracy Now! For the full interview, democracynow.org. That investigation by Inside Climate News and the Los Angeles Times led to a number of attorneys general announcing a historic effort to investigate Exxon and other oil companies for misleading the public about climate change. And that does it for our broadcast. A very happy birthday to Igor Moreno. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Dina Guzder, Sam Malkoff, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Tarina Nadura, and Andre Lewis. Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, and Paul Huckabee, our engineer. Special thanks to Becca Staley. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.